Hey guys, and welcome back to a new episode of Android News. This is the format in which I always summarize those news for you that are relevant for Android, for KMP, for Kotlin developers. Nowadays, I summarize those news from the past month. So in this episode for May, I will summarize everything from April. And I can already say this episode is going to be a juicy one. There are a lot of very relevant changes. The first relevant news is actually a workshop announcement, because on May 10th, I will host a free live online workshop about design patterns for Android and KMP developers. So how you can use the most important design patterns in Kotlin to really improve your code's architecture and structure. We'll be at 3 p.m. UTC, as I said, completely free. You can just sign up. First link in this video's description. Coming to the first really Android or Kotlin related thing, and that is an update on context parameters, as you can see here on this blog article. Context parameters are actually a new Kotlin feature that I am really looking forward to, which will at some point replace the already existing context receivers. The context receivers won't be continued. They still exist. Context parameters will replace them, not yet, but in future. So you can see in Kotlin version 2.2.0, which is the next one, the next bigger one at least that will come out, you will be able to opt into context parameters. So they won't yet be included as a standard feature in Kotlin, but you can opt into these with the, I think it's X context parameters as a compiler flag you have to add to the Kotlin compiler in order to really opt in and enable this feature. So what is this feature all about and why do I like it so much? Well, if we scroll down a little bit, we can see how this works. Previously, we had those context receivers, which you also had to opt in, which pretty much allowed this new context keyword here to provide context to a certain type of object to a function or to a class. And then, in this case, the save function could only be called in a context where you have access to a logger. So where in Kotlin the this keyword would reference a logger. However, there were a lot of debates about this context receivers feature. There were lots of improvement suggestions, which is why JetBrains decided to actually replace this with a slight adjustment of this feature, and that is context parameters. And the core difference here, at least in regards to how we need to specify this, is that for those context parameters, we now really need to give them a syntax like a real function parameters. We need to specify a name, we can have multiple of them, and then we can reference these here inside of the function body. You may now think, okay, what's the actual benefit of that? Why can't we just take this logger and pass it as a normal parameter to this function? And yes, we could. But in certain scenarios, having this context will be really useful, specifically when we, for example, want to write a custom extension function that kind of extends two properties at once, because extension functions right now can only extend a single property. And a typical example here is the typical state-in function to take a normal Kotlin flow and transform that into a state flow. Doing so requires a coroutine scope on the one hand, very commonly that is viewModel scope. Doing so requires passing in a sharing started value, so how, when and under which conditions this flow should be launched and cached in the state flow. And doing so requires an initial value. However, if we do this in viewModels, then we very commonly want to do this with while subscribed with 5 seconds delay. And we typically want to do this with a viewModel scope. However, we couldn't make this a real extension function because it was already extending the flow. So we couldn't also automatically extend the viewModel so that we could call this extension function only in the viewModel to immediately work with the coroutine scope, with the viewModel scope that we get from the viewModel. So passing in the scope was always necessary as a parameter. However, with context parameters, we can do something like this. So we can say that this state-in while subscribed function can only be called on flows and only within a viewModel, or at least in a context where we have access to a viewModel. So inside of a viewModel, we can just now call this convenient function while just needing to pass in the initial value, since that's the only thing that is really dynamic. And there are lots and lots of more such cool use cases that such context parameters will allow us in future. The little catch is that this new feature will require the new K2 Kotlin compiler, so the new version of the Kotlin compiler, which in my experience is still very buggy, at least in Android Studio. I've faced lots of syntax errors and errors that shouldn't be there when having enabled this K2 compiler. So right now I've actually disabled that in my IDE because it led to so many issues, but I strongly assume that this will improve in future. Next piece of news is about Google Play changes, because Google Play has improved in the way it reports certain metrics and issues to you if you have a deployed app there. On the one hand, in the Google Play console itself, you will now see a low memory kill rate. So maybe you know on Android, process death is a thing. It could happen that your app is in the background The OS says, yes, I'm hungry for memory. Let's pick certain apps to kill these because the user might not need them right now. And this information about which percentage of user sessions have been killed, that is now something you can see in the Play console. And this can be quite useful because you can see how big of a problem process death is in the context of your app. Because if process death happens, we as Android developers have to explicitly restore certain UI states that we want to restore after the user goes back to the recently seen screen. And while this is not desired for all kinds of states, there are certainly certain screens that strongly benefit from surviving process death, or at least restoring a crucial state from process death. For example, if the user has filled out a long form where they've entered a lot of possibly long text and text field, if they then leave the app is killed, all those states would be reset to the defaults, so empty strings, which would be very frustrating to the user. So you would need to explicitly implement something that restores these states, typically from saved state handle in a view model. Another interesting thing that Google Play added is a new kind of pre-review check, so a check that happens before your app is actually going to be reviewed, that checks if your app properly supports edge-to-edge on all kinds of devices, because that's nowadays mandatory. And in case this edge-to-edge enforcement of your app would not look ideal on certain device types, Google Play will tell you that before even reviewing your app. So quite useful, I think. And other than that, there is a new quality metrics dashboard in the first place. So in your release dashboard in the Google Play console, you will now be able to see certain other metrics that Google Play considers important for your app, just with a quite nice UI. So you immediately know what you should definitely act on right now and what is definitely something you should at least look at. Coming to the next news, and that is a new update for IntelliJ, specifically IntelliJ 2025.1. And while there are tons of new features and changes in IntelliJ 2025.1, let me summarize the most important ones, or at least the ones that I like the most. On the one hand, JetBrains AI features that are baked into the JetBrains IDEs like IntelliJ will now be accessible for free. So some of them have real unlimited use, for example, code completion, AI code completion, while others are based on a credit quota, so at some point you do need to pay for these AI features. Then this new IntelliJ version now provides full support for the new Java 24. For Kotlin projects, it uses Kotlin K2 by default, so as I said, the new, more performant Kotlin compiler, that is still a little bit buggy. I don't know how it is in IntelliJ, maybe it's an Android Studio thing that it's just buggy over there. I at least wouldn't be surprised. But also in IntelliJ, this is now the default, and if you run into any weird, wrongly highlighted syntax errors, then it's very likely that K2 is the issue, and you may want to still opt out of it for now. Then a feature that I really like in IntelliJ in general is the Kotlin Notebook feature. Kotlin Notebooks is in the end a feature that gives you a separate environment, independent of the project you're currently working on, where you can just quickly prototype Kotlin code. So to me at least, it happened very often that I had a certain function call in my real code, where I just wasn't sure what kind of values this function returns for certain inputs. For example, you are actually formatting a date in a specific way and you're unsure about what the specific output of that is. Then in order to find that out, normally you would have to include some kind of sample code in your project and run your project with sample inputs. So not really convenient, but with Kotlin Notebooks, you just get your own kind of terminal for Kotlin code where you can just quickly prototype a function, then execute it, and you immediately see the outputs and how this function behaves with certain inputs. And something in IntelliJ that is now very cool and interesting for all Spring Boot developers among you, and that is that the IDE will now let you generate Spring data repositories automatically the moment you use them in some kind of bean. So those kinds of repositories that you use in order to just interact with a data source like a remote database, for example, MongoDB. For that, you always work with these data repositories in Spring Boot. And the moment you now type something like node repository in your code, just as you would access a variable, Spring will auto-suggest creating a corresponding repository for you. However, this feature is only available for the Ultimate subscription of IntelliJ. Next up, let's talk about Room for a moment. So, Android's database framework of choice, because Room with its new version 2.7.0 now has full Kotlin multi-platform support. And while Room was already usable for KMP before, it's now a real KMP library. So that means that the Gradle artifacts from the Room library really also make use of the Kotlin multi-platform Gradle plugin. And the only true platform-specific code you have to implement in some way if you want to use Room for multi-platform is, on the one hand, declaring where the database file should be saved, because the location differs on the file system of the platform you develop for, and which specific database driver should be used under the hood, because that also differs on Android versus iOS versus desktop. But everything else, like defining your entities, defining your DAOs, the database instance itself, all that happens in the shared code. Next up, we have the beta 4 release of Android 16, and that is now the last beta that Google will actually release for version 16, because with the next release, Android 16 is actually already going to be considered stable, because recently what Google changed is that they went from 1 Android version release per year to 2 per year. So this Android 16 is now the first release from Google for Android this year, and the second one will then happen later this year with just a few more minor fixes and not that many crucial behavior changes. But now the last beta of Android 16 is now available. That means all the developer-facing APIs that were introduced with Android 16 are now also considered final, so they won't change anymore. You can also start targeting this version in your apps, so this will be available in Android Studio. You will be able to also post and publish your Android apps to Google Play already if they target this new version. So if you have an existing Android app in Google Play that does not yet target Android 16, I suggest to do that now, to change the target SDK in your app's code and then check what kind of necessary changes you actually need to make, so users can actually also, ideally use your app on that latest Android version, which comes out very soon. Next up, we have a very cool Jetpack Compose version release, and that one is really a cool one since it brings some really nice features that I have missed in Compose for a while. So the April version of Jetpack Compose brings especially cool features in regards to text formatting and the text composable itself. So on the one hand, for text fields, we can now implement an auto-filling text field so that certain types of fields can just be auto-filled by the Compose framework. But what I really like about the text composable is that we now have a new auto-size parameter. And we can use this parameter to pretty much tell a text to adjust its size automatically so it perfectly fits within its bounding box, so that it simply can't happen that parts of this text overlap, which was always the default behavior. And we could already achieve that we implemented like this, so that the text size auto adjusted. I also have an older video about that, but it was quite some pain and not a really ideal approach. This is especially very useful if you have users with different font size preferences. So some users, especially the older generation, may have a very large default font size set, and that very often breaks your UI in Android apps because you just preview your default font size while not considering that this can actually change. By using this new auto size attribute, you can just make sure that certain text will always fit their container. Next up, if you actually want to create certain annotated strings, so those strings in Compose that support formatting, that support coloring certain parts differently than others, that support making parts clickable, these now also support being parsed from HTML directly, which is not a new thing, but the new thing is that if your HTML code has bullet points, so has those UL and LI tags, then these will also be included in the annotated strings. So if you have an HTML text with bullets, then you can immediately now convert this to an annotated string in Compose, and those bullets will be properly formatted in your text composable. And last but not least, lots of experimental APIs from the Material 3 library are now considered stable, so we don't need to add all those experimental Material 3, experimental layout API annotations anymore. So not all of them are removed, but lots of important composables are now considered stable, like for example flow rows and flow columns. And let's get to the last but probably most exciting and interesting change, and that is a completely new product from Google, which is called Firebase Studio. You can see I am here inside of Firebase Studio. I've logged in, and the URL here is studio.firebase.google.com. And it's pretty much a cloud environment that lets you develop any type of software with AI. So on the one hand, we can prototype an app completely just from an AI prompt. So we can just define, hey, this app is what I need. And the cloud environment here will generate some code for you. And actually, you won't even see the code. You will immediately get the possibly running and working app here in your browser. But you can also alternatively start coding a new app. So one app here is considered a workspace in Firebase Studio. And you can see lots of languages are supported. There is also an Android Studio cloud here. So if you have problems running Android Studio locally because you have a weak machine or so, you will soon be able to do this in the cloud. Right now, if you click on this, there is a waitlist, so you can't yet access this, and therefore we can't also yet build real Android apps with this cloud environment. but I assume this will come very soon. And you can also see this is currently in preview. So things about this environment here can definitely change in future. But I've tried this out twice here. So you can see I have two apps and two workspaces that have been generated for me. And by default, this online IDE, this online environment generates web applications. And even though it's just in the preview state, it's really impressive what kinds of applications it can completely fully generate for us just from an AI prompt. So first of all, I gave it an AI prompt here to generate a scientific calculator, and I will also display the AI prompt here that I have entered, so you have some context about how little text is actually necessary to generate that. I entered this here in prototype an app with AI, and then hit enter. It took a few seconds, maybe 30, 40 seconds, until it really fully generated this project. And here's the outcome. We click on that. There we go, it's loading. And here is our little scientific calculator. And what I entered, as you've seen in the prompt, is that it should at least support all those basic operators, so adding, subtracting, dividing, and multiplication. And it should also support parentheses and power. And if you've ever developed such a calculator before that goes beyond just the normal arithmetics, then you know how complex it can actually be to properly parse such an expression and evaluate it so that the parentheses are parsed first, that we have powers that are also prioritized, and so on. So if we try this out, we can see, okay, we enter something like 2 plus 9. We take this to the power of 2, multiply this with 5 divided by, 17, and we subtract something like 2 plus 8. If we hit calculate, there is our result. And I've just typed this in my calculator, and it is exactly correct. Isn't that impressive? I really didn't have to write a single line of code. I really just gave it this rather short AI prompt. It generated all of that. It decided for a color theme. You can see this is the initial blueprint that Firebase Studio will give you. You can choose style guidelines. You can change those colors, but it also suggests a quite harmonic color theme. It tells you what kind of layout it will create, what kind of icons it will use. You can see by default this seems to be a React app here. And if you want, you can also click edit the code and see the code and edit it manually. But really, I did not type any line of code here by hand. That was generated as it is. And after having generated this project and after being quite impressed, I said, okay, how does it actually handle a little bit more complex types of projects? So I went ahead and I entered this prompt to generate a CRUD plant watering app. So in the end, an app where I can save my plants from home, where I can set certain reminders or certain day periods when these plants need water again. I wanted to be able to actually pass images to those plants, have proper filters to filter based on those that need water very soon, and then just see all of them in a grid in our main screen while being able to still edit existing plants, while being able to delete them, and of course create new ones. So let's click on Plant Pal that was generated here and see what it spit out for that. And here is Plant Pal. It fully generated this app. To be fair, the first time it actually created this, we got a runtime error. But what we also got is a big prominent button to fix that runtime error, which I simply clicked. It did some changes, and then it gave me this. So no plants found. We can click Add Plant, and here's our dialog to enter a new plant. So we can say, I don't know anything about plants, so let's just say Monstera. We need water every 5 days. For example, light, bright, indirect light. Light, bright, indirect light. We can add a note here, and we can upload an image. I must say that's the only feature that does not work if we don't choose an image here, or regardless of whether we choose an image. So we could click here, it would open our file browser. But regardless of what we do here, it will always AI generate some kind of random image, which I don't understand. So this is sometimes quite funny. If we click Add Plant, you'll see, okay, we have some kind of car here that the AI or the program actually picked. But it's still super impressive. I mean, we do see our plant here. We can still edit this plant. We can now say Monstera edited. Say, okay, we now need water every day. Save the changes, and it properly uploaded that in our DB. We get a nice little pop-up down here. We can sort this based on watering soon. We can add new plants. And you can see it again generated a random image for some reason, but we have 2 plants in here. And the moment it would need water, then this button would not be disabled, but we could click it to reset the watering state again. So this is super impressive. I didn't need to write a single line of code here. As I said, right now, it did not yet work for me for Android to really build Android apps. But since there is an Android Studio version or option, I strongly assume that this will come soon. And I'm actually really excited about this because you probably know this as app developers. We have so many cool app ideas in our mind, but we simply don't have the time to implement all those. And I think with all those AI advancements, we can just implement and build software so much faster. So we can also bring out useful products so much faster. So there's definitely a mental shift that will be required in future, that we don't make our work too dependent from the act of typing code, because that will get less. But I still see that a big part of our work is just interacting with AI to tell it what we want, because that's still a lot of text that will be required for a complex project where there are lots of edge cases. And this thinking about all those edge cases is just something a normal person does not have. So I really just see AI in regards to programming as the next revolution after having those high-level languages. So a language like Python, which introduces a lot of SDKs and libraries we can easily add to achieve a super complex functionality with a simple function call. And I see AI as being the next step that takes such high-level languages and combines such function calls in a way that we really get useful software. So it will strongly speed up our work in future. And even though this is just in preview and uses Gemini, which I wasn't that impressed of a while ago when Gemini was in preview, now apparently it has strongly improved. So good job, Google. It's important to say that this is currently free for up to 3 workspaces. For some reason I can't go back. Okay, now. Free for 3 workspaces, so 3 projects you can generate here. If you want more, then you need a paid plan in your Firebase console. But let me know what you think about this. Have you played around with Firebase Studio yet? And if so, how have the results been for you? As I said, Design Patterns Workshop for free. Link for registration is down below. Go there, takes a minute, and then you're in. And I will, of course, also go over all your questions. It's completely live, completely interactive. I will interact with the chat. I will help you out with all your worries and questions about architecture and design patterns on Android. So check it out. And other than that, thanks so much for watching. I will see you back in the next video. Have an amazing rest of your week. Bye-bye.